And action!
Okay. He helped us and repeat, and so that we could renew our vows. And we didn't know what he was going to say or anything about how the service would take place. And he had all 5 of our grandchildren stand up with us, our 3 grandsons and our 2 beautiful granddaughters. And it was just incredible. And during the service, my husband had been ill and he had had some major surgery from a brain hemorrhage and been helicoptered to Detroit and everything. And so he was shaking. He was so nervous. And during the service, when it came to, do you promise to love, honor, and obey, somehow he stopped after love and honor and he couldn't get the next word out. And so Scott says to my husband, "Say it, Dad, obey." And the whole place, there were about 100 people there, started just laughing. And we just had a great time. And yes, he did say obey. And we continued with this, with our vows, and it was just so much fun. And you'd have to know my husband to know how funny he was. And his sense of humor was just off the charts. And everybody loved him. He was a man who was so wise as well. And people would actually call us to help brainstorm. They wanted him to brainstorm with them to help them through issues that they were going through so they could make decisions based on information that he could provide. And he was like a historian. And we're doing something on history here. He could talk about the world wars. He was in the Vietnam War and served a year in Thailand where he was based, and then he was flown by helicopter into the paddies, the rice paddies, to recover downed aircraft. He worked on the F-4C fighter jets, and he was a crew chief for them. And he loved what he did and gave his whole heart and honored our country with his service. And I was so proud of him. And we had a wonderful marriage, a wonderful life together. We just held hands and went everywhere together and did things together. We loved to go to dances and weddings and parties and to church. We loved our church family. And we were youth leaders at one of the big churches here in town for about 3 years. And we used to take groups of 55 to 60 teenagers on 2- and 3-day canoe trips up north, and we'd go camping. And one year was a really funny year. It wasn't funny at the time, but afterwards it was. We had all of the sleeping bags and the tents and everything stacked on top of a carrier on top of the bus. And it was covered with a plastic cover-up and tied with ropes. Well, we ended up driving into a horrible rainstorm. It ripped and tore the plastic. The majority of everything on top of the bus was soaked by the time we got up north to the campground. And Butch and I had a small motorhome, and I was always one who liked to pack a lot of blankets and towels and things like that. And I'm so thankful that I did, along with other parents who had their units full. And we had to just put up the tents and toss out our towels and our blankets and everything we could to all of the young people to sleep with that night in their tents because everything was soaked. following day, the moms and I, the majority of the moms and I, we went to the laundromat. We spent about 6 hours at the laundromat, washing and drying kids' clothes, their duffel bags, their sleeping bags, their just everything, and their pillows. And that night we had it was like an outdoor auction. Whose socks are these? And it was just a great time. And we had a beautiful campfire, and kids were blessed and had so much fun. So there are so many times when we can go through troubles and just think the worst about this awful situation we're in, and turn it right around and have it become a great time, a time that will never be forgotten. And, you know, and people talk about those things more than they would talk about, oh yeah, we went camping and here's what we did in the canoe. The kids probably talked more about with their families, oh yeah, we had to sleep with a beach towel wrapped around us on the ground and the stones were under the tent, you know. And so it was just a time of reflection and fun. And those were the kinds of things that our family has always been involved in, are with youth and young people. And I love my grandchildren so much that eternity and back would not be able to explain how much my love is for them. And I feel the same way now that I have 2 great-grandchildren. And I just adore them. I'm older now. I can't keep up with them as good as I could keep up with my grandkids, but I sure do try. And it's just been a great life. And I don't know how to explain it any better. Do you have questions, Carrie?
Yes.
Okay.
What were some special traditions your family had around the holidays?
Oh my goodness. There are 2 special traditions that come to mind. Actually, I'll say 3. The first one is when my grandmother, Edna Sparling, was living. My aunts and my mom and my 2 uncles and their wives used to always get together every Christmas Day in the afternoon, and the entire family would be invited for Christmas dinner. They brought turkeys, ham, all the trimmings that they would come from everybody's homes, and they were incredible cooks, just beautiful cooks. Pies, cakes, everything you could think of to celebrate Grandma's Christmas. And it was awesome, and typically for the most part it was held in my aunt's home because they had room for anywhere from 50 to 70 people who would come from our family, because Grandma had 8 children and 40 grandchildren. My mother was the oldest of 8 children. I was the first of the great-grandchildren. I was the first of the grandchildren, and my first son was the first of the great-grandchildren, and my first grandson was the first of the great-greats. And so it was a real exciting time. The second tradition is one that Carrie is familiar with, and that's my mom and dad, Theo and Jerry Pearson's Christmas. And we used to try to hold these Christmases in our homes until the grandchildren from my brothers and myself and my husband started becoming adults themselves, and we kind of outgrew the houses. And so the last several years we've had it in a clubhouse, and Santa Claus used to come with bags full of presents for all the children, and they'd sit on his lap and just tell him what good kids they had been, and they couldn't wait for Christmas morning. And we put on the full Christmas dinner, and typically that is held the Saturday or the Sunday before Christmas. And we've been doing this for probably 27 years, 28 years. And then the third tradition is at our house, my husband and I. My husband just was ill, and he passed away in April of this year. So this will be our first Christmas without him. And it's going to be joyful because God is giving us strength for one thing, and my husband would not want it any other way than for it to be a happy and a joyful time. And I have promised him and the Lord that I will make sure that it is. And it's usually held on Christmas Eve, and that's where just our children, our grandchildren, their girlfriends and boyfriends, all come to our house. And we have a smorgasbord of food that just goes on all day long. They just eat, and they go back and they eat some more. And we open gifts galore, and my husband and I have always been softies when it comes to giving. And at Christmas time, it's our time to just do whatever we want and buy what we can and sometimes cannot afford for our kids and our grandkids. And it's just been a glorious time, and we celebrate the birth of our Lord and Savior. And it's just one of my favorite times of every year is at Christmas, because there's such serenity and beauty and the lights and the trees and the hustle and the bustle and people bumping into each other. I mean, you have to just take it all at stride and say, isn't this great? And those are the traditions that I remember best.
A smorgasbord of food?
Yes.
Where did you pull that out of?
Oh, it was up here somewhere.
Okay. Who was the oldest relative you remember as a child, and what do you remember about them?
The oldest family member that I can remember is my Grandma Sparling. And she lived to be a healthy 92 years old. And then the final couple years until she was 94 were not as healthy, and she was cared for by my mom and my aunt and their husbands. And as a child, Grandma was always there, and we would have family reunions where we had over 250 people come, because by the time you counted all the grandkids, the great-grandkids, their spouses, their children, by the time we all got together, there were that many. And the family reunions were huge. We had games for kids that would blow your mind. And one of the years that I recall that was hilarious was my cousin, who is like a woodsman. He went out and he caught a bunch of frogs and brought them to the reunion. And one of the games for the little children was making the frogs hop on this tarp that he dumped a bunch of water on so the frogs could hop around. And there were little 2- and 3-year-olds out there, all the way up to 8-year-olds, on this huge tarp full of water. They were slipping and sliding, falling. The frogs were hopping all over them, and they were screaming and laughing, and it was just a sight to behold. We just did things like that all the time, and there was always a big piñata, and the children would stand in line waiting for their turn in anticipation of breaking that thing open so they could get the candy. And the way they got more candy was Grandma had an apron. Grandma Sparling had an apron that was made for her, and it was full of pockets. And every time they went to great-grandma or grandma, depending on which one we were, and gave her a hug, we got to dip in our pockets and pull out a piece of candy. And it was just the time of our lives. And then the big baseball game would come on with the men, the boys, and the powerful women who wanted to play baseball. And those family reunions were held at another one of my aunt's houses where they had a huge backyard and all kinds of room, and their kids would come put up the great big tent tops to keep the sun off people, where we had a garage that was turned into a feast of food, and it was just great. And I'm sure you remember some of those, Carrie, when you were a little girl. I have pictures of you at those reunions.
I think I might recall something. I think so.
The hokey pokey. I've got pictures of you doing the hokey pokey with your mom.
Okay, that's scary.
And pictures of you waiting to hit the piñata. I have those, you and your sister. Oh, yeah. And when you were a baby, they brought you were just tiny the first year. And it was a great time, just wonderful times. Grandma, she was a good sport. She lost my grandpa when he was in his 30s, and she finished raising 8 children by herself. And I remember as a little girl going out to their house, and Grandma had a cistern pump in her kitchen at her kitchen sink that you had to prime in order to get water. And then water was heated on an oil burner that was in her dining area, and that oil burner heated the entire house. And she raised 5 girls and 2 boys in a 3-bedroom house. And the 5 girls shared 1 bedroom, and they would take turns sleeping on the couch so that each of them would have a chance to sleep in the bed. And they had a 3-foot wide closet for their dresses, and Grandma made them all. And one of the memories was her homemade bread. Oh, to die for. It was so delicious. And my mom tells stories about she was the oldest, and her job every morning was to slice the homemade bread that Grandma had made and baked the night before. And my mom's job was to slice the bread the next morning and make sandwiches for lunches for all 8 kids. And so you can imagine how many loaves of homemade bread my grandma made every night. Plus she worked full time. And we'd go out there as kids, and the whole family be there, and we'd be having wrestling matches with my uncles, and they'd be throwing us kids around like we were toys. And the memories, Grandma everything was done with ease and no problem. She had a huge garden, an outhouse. I hope the young people listening know what an outhouse is, because there was no inside toilet. So if you didn't want to have to go out in the middle of the night, you didn't want to drink much before you went to bed, and go out there in the dark and the cold. But I was a little girl and growing up before a bathroom was ever installed in Grandma's house. So that tells you how many years she raised those children during the Great Depression, and it was very hard. She was a professional seamstress, and she started out by making winter coats and snowsuits for a company called Erd Marshall that was located near Desmond Beach, or not Desmond Beach, but Desmond Landing. And the building was down there. And so Grandma was always taken there to go to work because she didn't have a car. And friends would pick her up and take her into work every day. And she made all of us kids snowsuits. All of us that were around at that time, and there were quite a few of us. And they were the Earl Marshall fabric was, this is a lot of history here, the Earl Marshall fabric was a type of fabric that you could, after it started to wear out, you could take the coat apart, flip the fabric, and turn it inside out and brush it, and it was like a brand new coat or snowsuit. So it just was incredible, fine quality. And then years later, Grandma became a professional seamstress for Jack and Jean Ealinger, who were drapery makers, and they had Grandma making draperies for the majority of the homes along our lake today. And doctors' homes, lawyers' homes, those were the people who could afford the draperies that my grandma made for them. And they had a shop up here at the north end of town on Lakeshore Road. And that's where Grandma worked full-time until she was 72 years old. And I remember after she retired, plus she kept her own little garden going. And she was always busy, going somewhere. And because of the size of our family, Grandma was never alone very much. Because there was always somebody saying, "Hey, Grandma, you want to go to lunch?" or "You want to go to dinner?" And the strength and endurance of this woman has flowed like a golden thread through her families and our families. And the love and the giving and the sharing. And I attribute those traits to my grandmother and her teaching and her example, and of what people should do to live well in life and experience joy even through the rough times. And when she was in her 80s and my folks were traveling back and forth to Florida, they'd get in their pickup truck, which is a pretty rough ride, and haul a trailer, and they'd say, "Hey, Mom, you want to go to Florida with us?" "Oh, yeah." So the three of them would sit in this little pickup truck front, and Grandma'd sit in the middle, and my mom on the one side, my dad on the other, and down the road they'd go. She was a great traveler. It only took her about 15 minutes to a half an hour to pack and be ready to go. And she was just amazing. And I would like to just pay tribute to her, and what a fine, wonderful example and woman to remember.
Okay.
More questions?
Yes. Just trying to process all that information about Grandma Sparling.
She used to know which bricks were donated by whom in the city of Port Huron on the streets. She walked them.
Wow.
Yes. So much history. I could go on forever.
Mm-hmm.
For a long time anyways.
So, what do you know of your surname?
Inch. My father was born in Ontario, Canada, and the Inches immigrated to Canada, and I believe that they immigrated from Ireland. I don't have a lot of history on them, and I don't know too much about it, but I know that my grandmother, she was only 4'10", and so I felt tall next to her, and I was only about 4'11" at that time when I was a kid. And that was my father's mom. And when my father was a kid, his mother and dad divorced, and his sister stayed with his mom, and his dad brought my father to the United States, where they lived in Ruby. And my Grandpa Inch remarried a wonderful lady, my other Grandma Inch, and they had 3 more children. And there was just this love. But as far as knowing much history about the Inches, I do not.
Okay. What's one story you have come down to about your parents? Yeah. What stories have come down to you about your parents? There we go.
Well, I can tell you one story that my mother told me that she and her girlfriends and her sisters did one time. When they lived on Sparling Road, there was a pond where they used to all go swimming. It was like a sand pit. And they would just have a blast out there. But there were some boys who in the neighborhood, and they were always teasing the girls and doing funny things. Well, one day the girls went down to the pond. They were going to go swimming, and they happened to get just part way down there, and they noticed that these guys were all swimming in the pond. But they weren't dressed. And the girls, including my mother, who is such a proper lady, as a teenager, her and her sisters and her girlfriends took the boys' clothes and ran off with them. And she has told that story just several times, and they got in a little bit of trouble, you know. And I just can't see my mother doing something like that. And yet she does have such a